Imagine being 7 years old when your mother disappears without a trace. One day she's there, tucking you into bed, kissing your forehead, and the next, she's gone. The closets are empty, the photographs vanish, and every time you ask your father where she went, he becomes silent, angry, unreachable. Years pass. Decades. You grow up believing she's dead, buried somewhere unknown, a ghost that haunts every family gathering, every birthday, every moment when you wish she could be there. 52 years go by. You're now in your late 50s. You have children of your own, grandchildren, and then one day the phone rings. On the other end of the line, a voice you haven't heard since childhood whispers 3 words that shatter everything you thought you knew. I'm still here. This is the true story of Lucy Ann Johnson, a woman who disappeared from Surrey, British Columbia in 1961, leaving behind 2 young children and a husband who would become the prime suspect in what police believed was a murder case. For more than half a century, the mystery haunted investigators, family members, and an entire community. But the truth, when it finally emerged, was more shocking than anyone could have imagined. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from, because this story will surprise you from beginning to end. Lucy Ann Carvel was born on October 14, 1935, in Skagway, Alaska, a small frontier town where the mountains meet the sea and winter seems to last forever. She was a child of the North, growing up in communities scattered across Alaska and the Yukon Territory, places where neighbors were few and survival meant resilience. Her parents, Margaret and Andrew Carvel, raised her in the remote community of Carcross, Yukon, where the population barely reached a few hundred souls, and where everyone knew everyone's business. Lucy was described by those who knew her as quiet, reserved, someone who kept to herself. She had dark brown hair, a dark complexion that spoke to her First Nations heritage, and at 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighing about 110 pounds, she was petite but strong. Life in the northern wilderness demanded strength, both physical and emotional, and Lucy had learned early how to endure. In 1953, at just 18 years old, Lucy left Carcross. The reasons weren't entirely clear, but those who knew her said she wanted something different, something beyond the isolated life of the Yukon. She drifted south, crossing into British Columbia, where the cities were bigger and opportunities seemed more abundant. It was during this period of transition, of searching for a new life, that she met Marvin Johnson. Marvin was a first mate on a tugboat, a working man with rough hands and a taste for alcohol. To Lucy, he might have represented stability, a chance to build something permanent after years of moving from place to place. They married in April 1954 in Blaine, Washington, a small border town between the United States and Canada. Lucy was 19. Whatever dreams she had for this marriage, whatever hopes she carried in her heart, they would soon be tested in ways she couldn't have anticipated. The newlyweds settled in the northern area of Surrey, British Columbia, a growing suburban community just outside Vancouver. Surrey in the 1950s was still developing, with new houses sprouting up along tree-lined streets, young families moving in with hopes of peaceful lives. Lucy and Marvin rented a modest home near 103rd Avenue and 145A Street, and for a brief moment, it must have seemed like they could build something real here. In 1954, Lucy gave birth to their first child, a daughter named Linda. A year later, in 1955, their son Daniel arrived. Lucy threw herself into motherhood, trying to create the kind of stable, loving home she had perhaps never fully experienced herself. She found work at St. Paul's Hospital in Vancouver, a prestigious medical center where she could contribute to the family income. She also maintained regular contact with the Catholic Aid Society, suggesting she sought community, support, perhaps even guidance during a time when being a young mother was both rewarding and overwhelming. But behind the facade of suburban normalcy, cracks were forming. Marvin's work on the tugboats was irregular, and by 1961 he had become unemployed. The stress of joblessness weighed on him, and his drinking increased. Neighbors would later recall hearing raised voices coming from the Johnson home, doors slamming, long periods of tense silence. Lucy began to withdraw even further, spending more time away from the house when she could, losing weight, appearing tired and worn down in ways that went beyond simple exhaustion. Linda, who was only 7 at the time, couldn't fully understand what was happening. Children rarely do. She knew her father had a temper, that sometimes his mood would shift without warning, that there were moments when it felt safer to be quiet, invisible. She remembered her mother moving through the house like a shadow, present but somehow distant, as if part of her was already somewhere else. And then, in September 1961, Lucy Ann Johnson walked out the door of that modest home in Surrey, packed a single bag, and disappeared. She left behind her children, her few possessions, her entire life as Lucy Johnson. A neighbor saw her leave, thought nothing of it at the time, perhaps assumed she was running an errand or visiting a friend. But Lucy never came back. Not that day, not that week, not for 52 years. When Lucy left, Marvin Johnson didn't call the police. He didn't file a missing persons report. He didn't alert the neighbors or reach out to Lucy's distant family in Alaska and the Yukon. Instead, he did something that would later seem far more sinister. He erased her. Within weeks of her disappearance, Marvin systematically removed every trace of Lucy from the house. Her clothes were gone. Her photographs were taken down from the walls and destroyed. Personal items, letters, anything that proved she had ever existed in that home vanished as completely as Lucy herself had. For 7-year-old Linda and 6-year-old Daniel, their mother's disappearance was never explained. When Linda asked where her mother had gone, Marvin would become angry, his face darkening, his voice sharp with warning. "Don't ask about her," he would say. "She's gone. That's all you need to know." After a few attempts, Linda learned to stop asking. Children learn quickly which questions are safe and which ones bring storms. She adapted to a new reality where her mother had simply ceased to exist, as if she had been a dream all along. Marvin remarried relatively quickly, bringing a new woman into the home to take on the maternal role. This stepmother became the only mother Linda and Daniel would know through their formative years. Marvin forbade them from speaking about Lucy, from even mentioning her name. It was as if acknowledging her existence would somehow threaten the new family structure he was trying to build. Linda grew up with fragmented memories, a child's incomplete recollections of a woman who had once been there and then wasn't. She remembered her mother's face, vaguely, the sound of her voice, perhaps, the feeling of being held, maybe. But as years passed, even these memories began to fade, replaced by the persistent, gnawing question, what had really happened? It wasn't until May 14, 1965, 4 years after Lucy had last been seen, that Marvin finally reported his wife missing. The timing was suspect from the beginning. Why wait 4 years? What had changed? The answer, police would later suspect, had to do with practicality rather than concern. Marvin wanted to remarry legally, and to do so, he needed to either divorce Lucy or have her declared legally dead. A missing persons report was the first step in that process. When Surrey Royal Canadian Mounted Police began their investigation, they quickly realized this was no ordinary missing person case. The 4-year gap between Lucy's disappearance and the report immediately raised red flags. When questioned, Marvin was vague, contradictory, defensive. He claimed Lucy had simply left, that she had walked out on the family, that he had no idea where she had gone. But his behavior during those intervening 4 years, the systematic erasure of her existence, suggested something darker. Investigators interviewed neighbors. One woman remembered seeing Lucy leave the house on a day in September 1961, carrying a bag, but she hadn't thought much of it at the time. Others recalled hearing arguments coming from the Johnson home, raised voices late at night, the sound of things breaking. Some neighbors mentioned that Marvin had dug a large hole in the backyard a few years earlier, claiming he was replacing the septic tank. That detail, combined with Marvin's evasive answers and the unusual circumstances of Lucy's disappearance, led police to a grim conclusion. They believed Lucy Ann Johnson had been murdered, and her husband was the primary suspect. The backyard was excavated, Officers dug carefully through the soil, searching for remains, for any evidence that would confirm their suspicions. They found the new septic tank exactly where Marvin had said it would be, but they found nothing else. No bones, no buried evidence, no proof that Lucy had been killed and disposed of there. The investigation stalled. Without a body, without physical evidence, without witnesses who could definitively say what had happened, the case went cold. Marvin was never charged. He continued living in Surrey, eventually succeeding in having Lucy declared legally dead, allowing him to remarry. His children grew up under the shadow of their mother's disappearance, with Linda in particular haunted by the unanswered questions. Daniel, her younger brother, would tragically drown in his late teens, taking with him any memories he might have had of Lucy. Linda was left alone with her grief, her confusion, and the persistent, terrible suspicion that her father might have killed her mother. Decades passed. Marvin died in the late 1990s, taking whatever secrets he held to his grave. The case remained officially unsolved, filed away in the Surrey RCMP's archives as one of their oldest cold cases. Linda grew older, had children of her own, became a grandmother. She told her family about the mother she barely remembered, the woman who had vanished when she was just 7 years old. And like everyone else, Linda believed Lucy Ann Johnson was dead, buried somewhere unknown, her fate forever a mystery. By 2013, the disappearance of Lucy Ann Johnson had been unsolved for 52 years. It was one of the oldest active missing person cases in the Surrey RCMP's history, a file that had been opened and closed countless times, reviewed by multiple generations of investigators, each one hoping to find the detail that previous officers had missed. But the case remained frustratingly opaque. No new evidence had emerged. No witnesses had come forward. Lucy had simply vanished into the past, becoming little more than a name in a decades-old file. But cold cases have a way of resurfacing, especially when someone refuses to let them stay buried. In June 2013, the Surrey RCMP launched a Missing of the Month series, a public awareness campaign designed to generate new leads on long unsolved disappearances. Each month, they would feature a different case, releasing photographs, details, timelines, hoping that someone in the public might remember something, might have information that could finally bring closure to grieving families. In late June, Lucy Ann Johnson's case was featured. The RCMP released her photograph, a picture from the early 1960s showing a young woman with dark hair and a reserved expression. They included the details of her disappearance. Last seen in September 1961, reported missing in 1965, believed to be a victim of foul play. The story ran in local newspapers, on community websites, on social media. For most people, it was just another tragic cold case, a sad reminder of the violence that sometimes lurks behind closed doors. But for Linda Evans, Lucy's daughter, now 58 years old, it was something else entirely. It was an opportunity. Linda had spent her entire adult life wondering what had happened to her mother. She had accepted, or tried to accept, that Lucy was dead. But acceptance didn't bring peace. The questions never stopped. Why had her mother left? Had she been killed? Had she suffered? Where was she buried? Linda had children of her own now, 5 of them, and 10 grandchildren. They had all grown up hearing fragments of the story, knowing they had a grandmother who had disappeared before any of them were born. It was a family wound that never fully healed, an absence that shaped Linda's life in ways she couldn't always articulate. When the RCMP featured her mother's case, Linda felt something shift inside her. She realized she didn't have to simply wait for the police to solve it. She could take action herself. She knew a few crucial details that investigators might not have fully explored. Lucy had been born in Alaska. She had grown up in the Yukon Territory, in small communities where families were interconnected, where people remembered each other across generations. If anyone had information about Lucy, it might be someone in the north, someone who had known her before she married Marvin, before she became Lucy Johnson. Linda made a decision. She would place advertisements in northern newspapers, in areas where her mother had lived before disappearing. She would appeal directly to the public, person to person, hoping that somewhere out there, someone remembered Lucy Ann Carville. On July 13, 2013, a small advertisement appeared in the classified section of the Yukon News. It was sandwiched between want ads and notices, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. But for those who were, the words were powerful. I am looking for my relatives, my grandparents. Names are Margaret and Andrew Carville. My mother's name is Lucy Ann Carville. She was born October 14, 1935 in Skagway. Linda included her email address, a simple invitation for anyone with information to reach out. The ad ran for several days. Linda waited, hoping, not really knowing what to expect. Maybe no one would respond. Maybe the trail was too old, the connections too severed. Maybe Lucy really was gone, and this last desperate attempt would lead nowhere. And then, the call came. A woman named Rhonda was at work in Whitehorse in Yukon when her brother phoned her. He had seen the ad in the Yukon News and thought she should take a look at it. Something about the details matched information he knew about their family. Rhonda pulled up the ad on her computer, read through the names, the dates, the places. Her heart began to race. The woman described in the ad, the missing Lucy Ann Carville, wasn't missing at all. She was Rhonda's mother. Rhonda had grown up knowing her mother only as Lucy, a woman who had built a life in the Yukon, who had remarried after a previous relationship ended, who had 4 children from her second marriage. Rhonda had never known her mother had been married before, that she had other children somewhere else, that she had been reported missing for more than half a century. It was like discovering her mother had an entire hidden life, a past that had been carefully, quietly left behind. Rhonda immediately contacted the RCMP. Officers in Whitehorse reached out to Surrey. Linda was contacted. And slowly, carefully, investigators began to piece together what had actually happened. Lucy Ann Johnson wasn't dead. She hadn't been murdered. She had been alive all along, living just 2,000 kilometers away from where she had disappeared, building a new life while her daughter Linda believed she was gone forever. When the news broke that Lucy Ann Johnson had been found alive, it sent shockwaves through Surrey, through the media, through everyone who had followed the case or remembered the mysterious disappearance from decades earlier. A woman missing for 52 years, presumed dead, the subject of a murder investigation, found alive in the Yukon. It seemed impossible, like something from a movie rather than real life. But it was real, and as the story began to unfold, the truth proved to be both more complicated and more heartbreaking than anyone had imagined. Lucy was 77 years old when she was located in 2013. She had been living in Whitehorse, Yukon, a small city of about 25,000 people in Canada's far north. She had remarried after leaving Surrey, and from that second marriage, she had 4 more children. Rhonda and her 3 siblings. The family lived quietly, unremarkably. Lucy worked, raised her children, became a grandmother. She wasn't hiding in any dramatic sense, wasn't living under an assumed name, or constantly looking over her shoulder. She had simply started over, building a new life in a place far from where her first life had fallen apart. But why? That was the question everyone wanted answered. Why had Lucy walked away from her children? How could a mother leave her 7-year-old daughter and 6-year-old son behind and never come back? The answer, when Lucy finally began to share it, painted a picture of a woman trapped in an impossible situation, making a devastating choice in a moment of desperation. Lucy told investigators and, later, her daughter Linda, that her marriage to Marvin Johnson had become unbearable. He was abusive, she said. The drinking had gotten worse, the violence more frequent. She lived in fear, never knowing when his temper would explode, when a minor disagreement would turn into something dangerous. And it wasn't just the abuse. Lucy claimed Marvin had been unfaithful, openly cheating on her with other women, humiliating her, making it clear that she was replaceable, that her presence in his life was more burden than blessing. In September 1961, things reached a breaking point. There was a fight, a terrible argument fueled by alcohol and rage. Lucy, terrified and seeing no way to make things better, made a decision. She packed a bag and left. She intended, she said, to take her children with her. But Marvin, in the heat of the moment, told her she couldn't have them. "You're not taking the kids," Rhonda would later recall her mother saying Marvin had declared. It wasn't clear whether this was a threat, whether Marvin physically prevented Lucy from taking Linda and Daniel, or whether Lucy, in her fear and desperation, simply fled without them, intending to return when she was safer, when she had a plan. But she never came back. Why? This is the part of the story that remains most difficult to understand, most painful for Linda to process. Lucy later claimed she believed the children were better off without her, that returning would only bring more chaos, more violence, more harm. She convinced herself, or perhaps had to convince herself, that Marvin would care for them, that his new wife would be a good mother to them, that leaving them behind was the selfless choice rather than the abandonment it appeared to be. Psychologists who work with domestic abuse survivors understand this kind of thinking. Trauma distorts perception. Fear can paralyze decision-making. A woman fleeing abuse often has to make impossible choices with incomplete information. And sometimes those choices, when viewed from the outside or from years later, seem incomprehensible. Lucy might have been so broken by the abuse, so convinced of her own worthlessness, that she genuinely believed her children would be better off without her. Or she might have been so terrified of Marvin that she knew returning would mean her death, and leaving the children behind was the only way to survive. After leaving Surrey, Lucy stayed in British Columbia for nearly 2 decades, working various jobs, keeping a low profile. Then around 1980 she moved north to the Yukon, returning to the region where she had grown up, where the landscape was familiar, and she could disappear into small communities where people minded their own business. There, she met another man, remarried, and started the second chapter of her life. She never told her new family about Linda and Daniel, never mentioned her previous marriage, never revealed that somewhere in British Columbia, she had left behind 2 children who believed she was dead. She never really was hiding, Rhonda would later tell reporters. She just lived her life. And in a way, that statement captures the strange, tragic paradox of Lucy's story. She wasn't actively concealing herself, wasn't living under a false identity or constantly moving to avoid detection. She had simply moved on. For reasons that made sense to her at the time, in the context of her trauma and fear, she had decided that her old life was over, that Lucy Johnson was gone, and that starting fresh was the only way to survive. When confronted with the discovery that she had been declared missing for over 50 years, that her daughter had spent decades believing she was dead, Lucy seemed shocked, but not particularly remorseful. According to those who spoke with her in the aftermath, she appeared to believe she had done what she needed to do, that her choices, however painful for others, had been necessary for her own survival. It was a perspective that was hard for many people to accept, including Linda. On July 20th, 2013, 8 days after Rhonda had seen the newspaper ad and contacted authorities, Linda Evans sat in her home in Surrey, staring at her phone. The number displayed on the screen had a Yukon area code. She knew who was on the other end. After 52 years, after decades of believing her mother was dead, after spending her entire adult life with unanswered questions and unresolved grief, Linda was about to speak to her mother. Her hand trembled as she answered, "Hello?" The voice that responded was older, weathered by time, but there was something in it that reached back across the decades, touching a memory Linda didn't even know she still had. "Linda, it's your mother." The conversation was awkward at first. How do you speak to someone who has been gone for more than half a century? What do you say to a mother who left when you were 7 and never came back? Linda later described it as surreal, like talking to a stranger who somehow knew her name, knew pieces of her history but was fundamentally unknown. The silences stretched long. The words came haltingly. But then Lucy said something that broke through the awkwardness. "You have about 200 relatives up here. I can hardly wait till you come up here." It was an invitation, an acknowledgement that Lucy wanted to know her, that the door to a relationship wasn't completely closed. And for Linda, who had prepared herself for rejection, for indifference, for a mother who didn't want to be found, those words were everything. Before the call ended, Linda said, "I love you." And Lucy, after a pause, replied, "I love you." It wasn't a perfect reunion. It wasn't a Hollywood ending where all the pain melted away and everything was instantly forgiven, but it was a beginning. In the weeks that followed, Linda and Lucy spoke regularly, short conversations that gradually became longer, easier. Lucy introduced Linda to her half-siblings, to Rhonda and her brothers, to a whole extended family Linda never knew existed. Rhonda, for her part, was generous and welcoming. "Oh, I've had her all my life and she hasn't," Rhonda told reporters, explaining why she was happy to share her mother with Linda. It was a remarkable display of empathy, a recognition that Linda's loss was greater, her need more acute. For Linda, the discovery that her mother was alive brought complicated emotions. Relief, certainly. Joy at knowing Lucy was safe, that she had lived a full life, that the terrible scenarios Linda had imagined, the violence and death she had feared, hadn't come to pass. But there was also anger, grief, confusion. Why hadn't Lucy ever tried to contact her? Why had she let Linda believe she was dead for so long? Why had she chosen her second family over her first? Linda struggled with these questions. In interviews, she was careful to say she had no hard feelings toward her mother, but the pain was evident. "I have a lot of questions and they're all ain't wise," she told the Surrey Now-Leader. "I just hope I can be part of her life." She also had to process the revelation that her father, whom she had suspected of murder for years, had been innocent of that crime. Marvin Johnson, who had died in the late 1990s, was officially cleared of any suspicion in Lucy's disappearance. The backyard that had been excavated, the years of suspicion and whispered rumors in the neighborhood, the terrible burden Linda had carried thinking her father might be a murderer. All of it was based on a misunderstanding. Marvin had been many things, an abuser, an alcoholic, a difficult father. But he hadn't killed Lucy. She had left of her own accord. Linda began planning trips to Whitehorse to visit her mother and meet her new family in person. She wanted to bring her grandchildren, to introduce them to the grandmother they had never known existed. She talked about possibly moving to the Yukon permanently, about building a relationship with Lucy while there was still time. At 77, Lucy's health was declining, and Linda was acutely aware that after losing her mother once, she didn't want to lose her again. But building a relationship after 52 years apart is complicated. They were strangers bound by biology and a shared past, but they had lived separate lives, formed separate identities, experienced decades of joy and pain that the other knew nothing about. Linda had to reconcile the mother she remembered, the woman from her childhood, with the elderly stranger on the phone. Lucy had to face the consequences of choices she had made decades earlier, choices that had rippled forward through time, causing pain she perhaps hadn't fully anticipated. The media coverage of the reunion was intense. The story of a mother found alive after 52 years captured international attention. People were fascinated by the mystery, the twist ending, the emotional reunion. But for Linda and Lucy, the media attention was overwhelming. They asked for privacy, for time to process what had happened, to figure out what kind of relationship they could build in the time they had left. As of today, more than a decade after Lucy was found, the full story of their reunion remains private. Whether Linda and Lucy managed to forge a meaningful relationship, whether the wounds of abandonment and absence could heal, whether forgiveness was possible, these are questions that only they can answer. What is certain is that Linda searched for her mother when everyone else had given up, and she found her, against all odds. Across decades of silence and distance, she brought her mother back from the dead. And sometimes, that act of searching, of refusing to let go, is its own kind of love.